The photograph measures 8 inches by 10, its edges browned with age and spotted with the residue of a century's careful storage. It was discovered in 2019, tucked between the pages of a county ledger at the Historical Society of Rural Pennsylvania, filed under Educational Records, Miscellaneous. No inscription, no date written on the back, just a single year stamped faintly in the corner. 1903. The image shows a classroom of children standing in a perfectly straight line against a whitewashed wall. Their teacher is absent from the frame. 32 children, ages estimated between 6 and 14, arranged by height from smallest to tallest. Boys on one side, girls on the other, hands at their sides, eyes forward. Not a single child smiles. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary school portrait from the turn of the century. Formal, rigid, typical of the era when photography required stillness and cooperation. But the longer one studies the image, the more something begins to settle in the mind like dust in still air. These children are not simply standing still for the camera. They are obeying, their shoulders pulled back with a tension that speaks not of pride, but of expectation. Their spines unnaturally straight, their chins slightly lowered, as if avoiding eye contact with something just beyond the lens. One girl near the center grips the fabric of her dress so tightly that the wrinkles are visible even in the faded sepia tone. A boy at the far left has his jaw clenched, the muscles visible along the side of his face. Another child, no older than 7, stands with her feet perfectly aligned, toes pointed forward as though measured with a ruler. There is no disorder here, no fidgeting, no childish distraction. In classrooms of that time, it was not uncommon for children to look serious in photographs. Smiling was considered improper, even disrespectful in formal settings. But this is different. This is not seriousness. This is fear wrapped in obedience. The kind of stillness that comes not from instruction, but from consequence. Their eyes do not wander toward friends or glance at the edges of the frame with curiosity. They stare straight ahead, fixed on a point that no longer exists. And in that frozen moment, they look as though they have done this before, as though they know exactly what happens if they move. The photograph was catalogued and digitized alongside hundreds of other educational documents from the region. For months, it sat unnoticed in an online archive until a researcher conducting a study on early American schooling methods came across it during a keyword search. She was looking for images that demonstrated classroom order and discipline. What she found instead stopped her from continuing her work for 3 days. She later described the image as unsettling in a way she could not articulate. She printed it, examined it under magnification, shared it with colleagues, and each person who looked at it felt the same quiet unease. Something about the way the children stood, something about their expressions, something about the absolute uniformity of their obedience. Historians and archivists began to trace the origins of the photograph. The county records offered little context. The ledger it was found in dated to 1904, 1 year after the image was taken. It had been filed alongside budget reports and teacher salary records, but there was no accompanying documentation, no note explaining who took the photograph or why, no list of names identifying the children, no mention of the school itself, just the image carefully preserved, as though someone wanted it to survive even if the story behind it did not. Researchers compared the clothing styles, the architecture visible in the background, and the photographic techniques used. All confirmed the 1903 date. The location was narrowed to a rural district in southwestern Pennsylvania, an area known for its coal mining communities and isolated one-room schoolhouses. But the most unsettling discovery came when the photograph was compared to other classroom images from the same period. In nearly every other photograph from that era, there is some trace of childhood. A crooked collar, a half-smile fighting its way through formality, a hand slightly out of place, a glance exchanged between friends. But here there is nothing. Just 32 children standing in a line as though they have been trained for this moment. As though the line itself is not a pose for the camera, but a routine they know by heart. And the question that began to surface among those who studied the image was simple and chilling. What were they afraid would happen if they broke the line? The photograph does not answer that question. It only preserves it. And as researchers began to dig deeper into the records of rural Pennsylvania schools in 1903, they realized that the silence in this image was not an accident. It was a system. The early 1900s marked a strange and contradictory period in American education. On paper, the system was built on ideals of progress, literacy, and civic duty. Compulsory education laws were spreading across states, and reformers championed the schoolhouse as the great equalizer. But in practice, particularly in rural and working-class communities, schools operated less as places of learning and more as institutions of control. Order was valued above understanding. Silence was prized over curiosity. And discipline was enforced not through reason, but through fear. The official records from Pennsylvania's rural school districts in 1903 paint a portrait of structure and efficiency. Attendance logs were meticulously kept. Curriculum guidelines were distributed by the state. Teacher certifications were issued and renewed. But between the lines of these documents, another story begins to emerge. Historians examining county education records from the period discovered a pattern in the language used by school boards and administrators. Words like deportment, submission, and orderliness appeared with striking frequency in teacher evaluations. Academic achievement was mentioned, but always secondary to behavior. A teacher who maintained a quiet classroom was praised above one who inspired intellectual growth. A student who sat still was valued more than one who asked questions. Punishment was not only accepted but expected. School board meeting minutes from 1902 and 1903 reference the purchase of wooden paddles, leather straps, and canes. These items were listed alongside chalk, slates, and textbooks as standard classroom supplies. In one district report, a teacher was commended for maintaining discipline so effectively that the school board noted her students could be heard reciting lessons with no disruption whatsoever, even during inspections. But official punishment policies tell only part of the story. Interviews with descendants of former students, conducted over the past decade, revealed a different reality. Punishments were not always recorded. Teachers had wide discretion in how they maintained order, and in isolated rural schools, oversight was minimal. Parents rarely questioned a teacher's methods. The teacher's authority was absolute. And in communities where survival depended on hard labor and strict adherence to social norms, children were taught from an early age that obedience was not optional. It was survival. One descendant, whose great-grandmother attended a school in the same region in 1903, recalled a story passed down through the family. The children were required to stand in a line every morning before lessons began. They were not told why. They were simply expected to know. If a child moved out of line, spoke, or failed to stand with correct posture, they were removed from the classroom. What happened during that removal was never spoken about. But the children who returned were quieter afterward. Psychologists who study historical trauma and childhood conditioning have examined these accounts alongside the photograph. What they describe is a form of behavioral training that relied not on explanation, but on routine and consequence. The children were not taught the rules. They learned them through observation and repetition. They learned that standing still meant safety, that silence meant approval, that breaking the line meant something they could not afford to experience. Dr. Helen Carver, a historian specializing in educational practices of the progressive era, described it as a culture of invisible discipline. The rules were never written down because they did not need to be. The children absorbed them through the environment itself, through the tone of the teacher's voice, through the way other children flinched when the door closed, through the stillness that followed a mistake. Comparisons with other classroom photographs from the same period reveal just how unusual this level of uniformity was. In images from urban schools, wealthier districts, or institutions with progressive leadership, children display a range of expressions and postures. Some look bored, some look proud, some glance away from the camera or shift their weight from one foot to the other. But the children in the 1903 photograph show none of this. Their uniformity is not the result of a single moment of stillness captured by a slow shutter speed. It is the result of training, of expectation, of something drilled into them over time until it became second nature. They are not posing. They are performing obedience. And the line they stand in is not a temporary arrangement for the camera. It is a structure they know intimately, a formation they have practiced until it became reflex. The records do not explain why this particular school operated with such severity. There are no reports of abuse, no scandals, no investigations, just quiet efficiency and exemplary discipline. But the absence of documentation is itself revealing. In systems where power is concentrated and accountability is minimal, the worst practices are often the ones that leave no paper trail. And so the photograph becomes the only evidence. A single frame capturing what was never meant to be questioned. A line of children who knew the rules so well that they followed them even when the teacher was not in the room. When the photograph is magnified, the details that were invisible to the casual glance begin to assert themselves with uncomfortable clarity. The faces of the children are no longer a collective blur of obedience. They become individuals, each carrying their own small burden of tension. Near the center of the line, a girl of about 10 years old stands with her chin slightly tilted downward. Her eyes are open, but the focus in them is absent, as though she has learned to look without seeing. Her hands hang at her sides, but the fingers are curled inward, not quite making fists, but not relaxed either. It is the posture of someone holding themselves in place through will alone. To her left, a boy no older than 8 has his lips pressed together so tightly that the skin around his mouth appears pale. His shoulders are raised just slightly, as though bracing for something. His gaze is fixed forward, but there is a rigidity in his neck that suggests he is forcing himself not to turn his head. The smallest child in the line, a girl who cannot be more than 6, stands at the far end with her hands clasped in front of her. Her dress is too large, the hem brushing the floor, and her hair is pulled back severely from her face. But it is her expression that arrests attention. There is no innocence in it. No trace of the wonder or distraction that children of that age typically display. Instead, there is a kind of watchfulness, a premature awareness that suggests she has already learned that the world is not safe. That mistakes have consequences. That stillness is the only protection. Her feet are positioned with such precision that they might have been placed by someone else's hands. And in the faint shadow beneath her chin, there is a suggestion of tension in her jaw, as though she is clenching her teeth. Psychologists who work with trauma survivors have noted that certain physical responses to chronic stress become embedded in the body's memory. Children who grow up in environments where punishment is unpredictable and authority is absolute often develop what is called hypervigilance. They learn to monitor their surroundings constantly, to control their movements, to suppress natural impulses in favor of behaviors that ensure safety. The posture of the children in the photograph is consistent with this kind of conditioning. Their bodies are not relaxed, they are held, and the holding is not the result of a momentary instruction from a photographer. It is the result of repetition, of weeks, months, perhaps years of standing in this line and learning that any deviation brings consequences they cannot afford. The differences between the boys and girls in the photograph are subtle but telling. The boys, particularly the older ones, stand with their hands clenched at their sides. Several have their fingers pressed against the seams of their trousers, as though mimicking a military stance. Their expressions are harder, more closed. The girls, by contrast, tend to have their hands clasped in front of them or hidden in the folds of their skirts. Their faces are more uniformly blank, as though they have learned to erase emotion entirely. This division reflects the gendered expectations of the time. Boys were expected to display physical discipline and restraint. Girls were expected to embody quietness and submission. But both groups share the same underlying tension. The same stillness that feels less like calm and more like suppression. Comparisons with other photographs from the same era make the contrast even more striking. In a classroom image from Boston taken in 1904, the children stand in rows, but their posture is loose. One boy has his hands in his pockets. A girl near the front is looking off to the side. Another child appears to be mid-blink. These are the natural imperfections of childhood captured in a moment of temporary stillness. But in the 1903 photograph, there are no imperfections, no lapses, no signs of distraction or discomfort. The children are flawless in their obedience. And that flawlessness is what makes the image so unsettling, because it suggests that this is not a moment captured. It is a performance rehearsed. One researcher, after spending days examining the photograph under magnification, noted something that had gone unnoticed in earlier analyses. In the background of the image, just visible along the edge of the frame, there is a shadow on the wall. It is faint, distorted by the angle of the light, but it appears to be the outline of a figure standing just outside the camera's view. The shadow is tall, suggesting an adult. and the position of the shadow suggests that the person is standing directly in front of the children, facing them. The photographer would have been behind the camera, positioned to capture the line from the front. But this shadow belongs to someone else. Someone who was present during the photograph but chose not to be seen. And the children, standing in their perfect line, are not looking at the camera. They are looking at the shadow. The building where the photograph was taken no longer stands. It was demolished in 1957, replaced by a consolidated school district facility that served multiple towns. But county records from the early 1900s include a detailed floor plan filed with the State Education Board in 1901, 2 years before the photograph was taken. The schoolhouse was a single-story wooden structure with a peaked roof and a stone foundation. It measured 40 feet by 25 feet, with a single large classroom occupying most of the interior. At the front of the room was a raised platform where the teacher's desk sat. Behind the desk, a blackboard stretched across the wall. Along the sides of the room were rows of wooden benches, bolted to the floor, each designed to seat 3 children. The benches faced forward, toward the teacher. There were no windows on the front wall. The only natural light came from narrow windows set high along the side walls, too high for a child to see through while seated. But it is the back of the building that draws attention in the floor plan. Behind the main classroom, accessed through a single door, was a smaller room measuring roughly 10 feet by 12 feet. The floor plan labels it simply as storage. No further description is provided. No indication of what was stored there. No notes on its use. Just a small, enclosed space separated from the main classroom by a single door. In interviews with descendants of former students, this room is mentioned repeatedly. One woman, whose grandmother attended the school in 1905, recalled being told that children were taken to the back room when they misbehaved. What happened there was never explained. But the children who returned from the back room were different, quieter, more compliant. Another descendant described hearing that the back room had no windows, that the door was thick enough to muffle sound, that children learned quickly not to do anything that would result in being taken there. Renovation records from 1948, filed during a minor repair project before the building's eventual demolition, include a brief note from the contractor. The note describes the discovery of heavy iron brackets mounted on the walls of the back room, positioned at a height of approximately 4 feet from the floor. The brackets had been removed at some point, but the mounting holes remained. The contractor speculated that they may have been used to hold shelving, but the positioning was unusual. Shelves in storage rooms are typically installed higher on the wall to maximize space. These brackets were mounted at a height that would place them at chest level for a child. The note offers no further analysis. The brackets were patched over, and the work continued. But the detail remained in the file, a small anomaly that went unexamined for decades. Oral histories collected from the community in the 1970s, part of a regional preservation project, include several mentions of the schoolhouse. Most of the recollections are vague, filtered through the passage of time and the reluctance of elderly residents to speak ill of institutions they once respected. But certain phrases appear repeatedly. One man, born in 1898 and educated in the same district, described the school as a place where children learned to behave. When asked what he meant, he clarified that the lessons taught were not always academic. Another woman, aged 92 at the time of her interview, mentioned that her older brother attended the school for 2 years before her family moved to a neighboring town. She remembered him returning home each day and going directly to his room. He did not speak about school. He did not play with his siblings. When their mother asked him what was wrong, he told her that he had learned to follow the rules. That was all he would say. The architecture of the schoolhouse reflects the broader philosophy of rural education in that era. The raised platform at the front created a physical separation between the teacher and the students, reinforcing the hierarchy. The bolted benches ensured that children could not rearrange themselves or move freely. The high windows prevented distraction and limited the children's connection to the outside world. The back room, whatever its true purpose, added an element of threat. It was a space that existed beyond visibility, where accountability ended and authority could operate without witness. The schoolhouse was not designed to encourage curiosity or comfort. It was designed to produce obedience, and it did so with architectural efficiency. Photographs of the exterior, taken in the 1930s before the building fell into disrepair, show a structure that appears unremarkable. A modest wooden building with peeling paint and a sagging roofline. A front porch with 2 steps. A narrow door. But inside those walls, a system operated that left no official record. Only the photograph remains as evidence. Only the faces of the children, standing in their perfect line, offer testimony. And only the shadow on the wall behind them suggests who enforced the rules they learned so well. Memory is fragile. It shifts with time, shaped by the teller and the listener, distorted by the need to make sense of the past. But certain stories refuse to fade. They are passed down not as history, but as warning, as inheritance, as something that must be remembered even when it cannot be fully understood. The descendants of the children in the 1903 photograph carry fragments of these stories. Most do not speak about them openly. Some were told never to repeat what they heard. Others only learned the truth after a grandparent or great-grandparent passed away, leaving behind letters or diaries that were not meant to be read by outsiders. But when these fragments are gathered together, a pattern emerges. A collective memory of a system that operated on silence and fear. One woman, now in her 70s, recalls her grandmother speaking about the school only once. It was late in the evening, and her grandmother had been sorting through old photographs, preparing to pass them down to the next generation. She came across an image of a young girl in a high-collared dress, standing alone in front of a wooden building. The woman's grandmother stared at the photograph for a long time, and then she said something that the woman never forgot. She said that the girl in the photograph had learned to stand very still. That stillness was the only thing that kept her safe. When the woman asked what she meant, her grandmother closed the album and did not speak of it again. But years later, after her grandmother's death, the woman found a letter tucked inside the same album. The letter was undated, written in a careful hand, addressed to no one. It described a classroom where children stood in a line every morning, where silence was not requested but required, where mistakes were corrected in a room at the back of the building, behind a door that locked from the outside. Another descendant, a man in his 60s, inherited a small leather-bound diary from his great-grandfather. The diary covered 3 years, from 1902 to 1905, and included daily entries written in a child's uneven handwriting. Most of the entries were brief, single sentences describing chores, weather, or family events. But scattered throughout were references to school that stood out for their tone. One entry from October 1903 reads simply, "I did not move today." Another from November of the same year stated, "Mary was taken to the back. She came out after a long time." A third, written in January 1904, noted, "The line was perfect. Miss Wright said nothing." The entries never elaborated, never explained, but taken together, they suggested a routine that was understood by all the children and questioned by none. Phrases appear across multiple accounts that suggest a shared language of fear. Children were told to stand properly, to wait quietly, to remember the consequences. These were not casual reminders. They were instructions delivered with weight, as though the consequences were already known and too severe to risk testing. One descendant described hearing that children were taught to count to 100 in their heads while standing in line. If they reached 100 and had not been dismissed, they started again. The counting was not a game. It was a survival strategy, a way to endure stillness without breaking, a way to focus the mind on something other than the ache in their legs or the fear of what would happen if they moved. Several accounts mention specific teachers by name, though records from the time are incomplete. One name appears more frequently than others, Miss Adelaide Wright. She taught in the district from 1900 to 1906 and was, by all official accounts, a model educator. School board records commend her for maintaining exemplary discipline and producing students who excelled in standardized examinations. Letters of recommendation from local clergy and civic leaders describe her as firm but fair, dedicated to the moral development of her students. But the private accounts tell a different story. One great-granddaughter of a former student described hearing that Miss Wright rarely raised her voice, that she did not need to, that her silence was more frightening than any shout, that she had a way of looking at a child that made them understand they had made a mistake before she said a word. The consistency of these accounts is what makes them compelling. These are not exaggerated tales of cruelty passed down for shock value. They are quiet, restrained memories of a system that operated within accepted norms. Punishment was not seen as abuse. It was seen as correction. And the children who endured it were not seen as victims. They were seen as students learning discipline. The silence that surrounded the system was not a cover-up. It was simply the way things were. No one questioned it because no one thought to question it. And so the children stood in their lines, and learned to count to 100, and came home each day a little quieter than before. The photograph captures one moment in this system. But the stories passed down through families suggest that the moment was not unique. It was routine, and the children in the line knew exactly what was expected of them. Not because they had been told, but because they had already learned. Power in isolated communities is often held by those who appear least threatening. The rural schoolteacher of the early 1900s was not a figure of wealth or political influence. They were modestly paid, often young, and frequently lacked formal training beyond a basic certification. But within the walls of the schoolhouse, their authority was absolute. Parents did not challenge them. Students did not question them. And in communities where survival depended on discipline and hard labor, the teacher was seen as an extension of the social order itself. Miss Adelaide Wright embodied this authority. Born in 1875 in western Pennsylvania, she completed her teacher certification at the age of 23 and was assigned to the rural district in 1900. Her first year was marked by glowing reports from the school board. Her classroom was quiet. Her students performed well on examinations. And she maintained order without the chaos that plagued other teachers in the region. By 1903, the year the photograph was taken, Miss Wright had established herself as a fixture in the community. She boarded with a local family, attended church every Sunday, and participated in civic events. She was respected, admired even. Parents praised her for instilling discipline in children who had previously been difficult to manage. School board members pointed to her classroom as an example of what education could achieve when properly administered. In a region where many teachers struggled to maintain control, Miss Wright's success was seen as evidence of her skill and dedication. But beneath the commendations, there were details that went unspoken. Details that only became visible when examined through the lens of what the children remembered. In 1904, 1 year after the photograph was taken, a school board meeting included a brief discussion about the need for additional supplies. The minutes note that Miss Wright requested funds for what she described as corrective materials. The request was approved without debate. No itemized list was provided. No explanation of what the materials were or how they would be used. The following year, in 1905, a parent wrote a letter to the school board expressing concern that her son had returned home with bruises on his arms. The letter was filed and acknowledged, but no investigation was conducted. The response, written by the board chairman, stated that disciplinary measures were at the discretion of the teacher and that parents should trust the judgment of certified educators. The matter was closed. The parent did not write again. Miss Wright left the district in 1906, 3 years after the photograph was taken. Her departure was noted in the school board minutes as a regrettable loss. She relocated to a neighboring county, where she continued teaching for another 12 years before retiring in 1918. Her later career was unremarkable. No complaints, no controversies. She lived quietly until her death in 1943, leaving behind no family and few personal effects. Among her belongings, donated to a local historical society, was a small collection of teaching materials, lesson plans, grade books, a ruler marked with precise measurements, and a leather strap, worn smooth with use, tucked into the bottom of a wooden box. The strap was never displayed. It remained in storage, catalogued as a general artifact from the period, until it was rediscovered during an inventory in 2018. By then, the photograph had already been found, and the connection between the two became impossible to ignore. The psychology of authority in isolated environments is well documented. When oversight is minimal and accountability is absent, those in power are free to define the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Miss Wright's methods were not seen as excessive because there was no framework for judging them. The community trusted her. The children obeyed her. And the system protected her. She did not need to justify her actions because no one asked her to. The silence that surrounded her classroom was not evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of efficiency. And in a time when order was valued above all else, efficiency was rewarded. The photograph does not show Miss Wright. She is not standing with the children. She is not visible in the frame. But her presence is undeniable. It is in the way the children stand, in the way they hold themselves, in the way they stare forward with expressions that have learned not to reveal anything. She is the shadow on the wall, the authority that does not need to be seen to be felt. And the line of children is her creation, a testament to her ability to shape behavior through fear and repetition, to produce obedience without question, to ensure that the rules are followed even when she is not in the room. The exact date the photograph was taken is not recorded, but the season can be inferred from the clothing of the children. The girls wear long-sleeve dresses with high collars, and the boys are in woolen trousers and buttoned shirts. The fabric is heavy, appropriate for late autumn or early winter. The light in the photograph is soft and diffuse, suggesting an overcast day. The photographer, whose name does not appear in any surviving records, would have arrived at the schoolhouse in the morning, carrying the heavy equipment required for the exposure. A large-format camera mounted on a tripod, glass plates coated with light-sensitive emulsion, a black cloth to shield the lens between preparations. The process of taking a photograph in 1903 was slow and deliberate. It required stillness from the subjects and patience from the operator. But the children in the photograph were already still. They did not need to be instructed. The photographer would have positioned the camera at the front of the classroom, angled to capture the full line of children. He would have adjusted the focus, checked the exposure, and asked the children to hold their positions. But there is no record of him giving such an instruction, because the children were already holding their positions. They had been standing in that line long before he arrived. The photograph was not taken for the children. It was not a commemorative portrait meant to celebrate their education or preserve their youth. It was taken for the record, for the school board, for the state education office, for anyone who might question whether the schoolhouse was maintaining the standards expected of a certified institution. The photograph was proof of order, proof of discipline, proof that the system was working. Miss Wright would have been present during the exposure. She would have stood at the front of the room, just outside the camera's view, watching the children as the photographer prepared the shot. She would not have needed to say anything. Her presence alone would have been enough to ensure compliance. The children knew what was expected. They had practiced this, not for the photograph but as part of their daily routine. The line was not a pose. It was a formation they stood in every morning before lessons began, every afternoon before dismissal, every time Miss Wright required their attention, and they knew that any deviation from the line would result in correction. So they stood, perfectly, silently, without question. The exposure would have taken several seconds, long enough for the light to burn the image onto the glass plate, long enough for any movement to blur the photograph. But there is no blur, no ghosting, no evidence of even the smallest shift in position. The children did not move because they had learned not to move. And when the photographer finally released the shutter and announced that the image was captured, the children did not relax. They did not break the line. They waited, because they had not been dismissed, and they would not move until Miss Wright gave them permission. The photographer packed his equipment and left. The children remained standing, and only when the door closed behind him did Miss Wright speak. One word, enough to release them, enough to send them back to their seats, enough to remind them that the line was not for the camera. It was for her. The photograph was developed and printed in the days that followed. One copy was filed with the school board. Another was sent to the state education office. A third was kept by Miss Wright, though it was never displayed. The image served its purpose. It documented the efficiency of the schoolhouse, the discipline of the students, the effectiveness of the teacher, and it was filed away unremarkable among hundreds of other similar records from rural schools across Pennsylvania. No one looked at it and saw fear. No one studied the faces of the children and recognized the signs of conditioning, because those who held power saw only what they wanted to see: order, obedience, success. But the children saw something else. They saw a permanent record of a moment they could not escape. A moment when they stood in a line and proved that they knew the rules, that they had learned their lessons, that they would not break. And as they returned to their seats that day, and the weeks and months continued, the memory of the photograph faded into the routine, into the silence, into the stillness that defined their education. But the image remained, preserved, waiting, until someone finally looked at it and asked the question the children were never allowed to ask. What were they so afraid of? The schoolhouse was torn down in 1957. The land where it stood was sold and subdivided. A small residential street now occupies the site, and no marker indicates what once existed there. Miss Adelaide Wright died in 1943, her obituary noting her decades of service to education. The children in the photograph grew up, left the district, and scattered across the country. Most married. Some had children of their own. A few lived into the late 20th century, long enough to see a world transformed by technology and social change. But none of them, as far as records indicate, ever spoke publicly about their time in that classroom. They carried their memories in silence, just as they had been taught. And when they died, those memories died with them. Or so it seemed. The photograph survived because it was never important enough to destroy. It was filed, archived, digitized, and forgotten, until someone looked at it closely and recognized what it truly was. Not a portrait of a classroom, not a celebration of education, but a document of a system that operated on fear and called it discipline. A system that produced obedience and called it success. A system that left no official record of wrongdoing because what was done was never seen as wrong. The children in the photograph were not abused by the standards of their time. They were educated. And the methods used to educate them were not questioned because they produced results. Quiet children, compliant children, children who learned to stand in a line and wait for permission to move. No charges were ever filed. No investigations were conducted. No apologies were issued, because there was nothing to investigate. The school board records show only efficiency and praise. The state education reports show only compliance with standards. And the community, which trusted its institutions, saw no reason to question what happened behind the walls of the schoolhouse. Miss Wright was respected until the end of her life. The parents who sent their children to her classroom believed they were providing them with an education. And the children, who stood in that line and learned to count to 100 in their heads, grew up believing that what they experienced was normal. That stillness was safety. That obedience was survival. That the consequences of breaking the line were something they should never speak about. The photograph forces a confrontation with the past that many are uncomfortable facing. It asks what society was willing to accept in the name of order. It questions what was lost when compliance became more important than curiosity. And it reminds us that the absence of documented abuse does not mean the absence of harm. The children in the photograph were harmed, not through a single act of violence, but through a system that taught them to suppress themselves, to erase their instincts, to stand perfectly still while their childhood was shaped into something that served the adults around them. They survived, but survival is not the same as thriving. And the photograph captures a moment when survival required them to become smaller than they were. Historians who study the image now see it as representative of a broader pattern in early American education. Particularly in rural and working-class communities, schools were designed to produce laborers, not thinkers. Citizens who obeyed, not citizens who questioned. The methods used were not accidental. They were deliberate, and they were effective. But the cost was borne by the children, by their bodies trained to hold stillness, by their minds trained to accept authority without question, by their voices trained to remain silent. The photograph is evidence of that cost. It is testimony given without words. And it is a reminder that the past is not as distant as we might prefer to believe. The line of children remains frozen in 1903. They will never grow older in the image. They will never move. They will never break formation. But they are no longer silent, because the photograph has been seen, studied, understood, and the questions it raises cannot be filed away. They demand acknowledgement. They demand reflection. And they demand that we recognize the difference between order and safety, between discipline and control, between education and conditioning. The children in the photograph knew the rules. They followed them perfectly, and the photograph preserved the moment when their obedience became permanent. A single frame, a single line, a single truth. They were afraid, and no one asked why.